Hi, my name is Yatsu. I'm chairman and co-founder of Animoca Brands, and it's a great pleasure for me to talk to you today about the metaverse and the future of digital property rights, especially in areas such as gaming and what it means for us in the future. First, a little bit of the state of the market. One of the interesting things is that in the last 6 months or so, most of the investments that have taken place in blockchain have gone into the areas of Web3, and in particular, in the areas of blockchain gaming. And of course, you can see that not only is Animoca Brands an active investor, but there's many other investors in the space that are continuing to support the market, indicating that despite the economic slowdown, there is general support in this next iteration of what we describe as Web3 or the next iteration of the internet. And when you generally take a look at the investment space, particularly what's happened in blockchain, you'll also notice that NFTs and gaming in particular in the global space have received most of the funding over the last period, including as late as August 2022, the majority of funding has gone into NFTs and gaming related projects globally. One of the reasons why so much investment is happening in the space is because it is a battle for this next iteration of the internet, the definition of the metaverse. And one of the other areas that's also interesting is that despite the fact that so many people are trying to vie for positions in what you could argue is a kind of control of the metaverse, there's also the fact that in a place like Asia, where we're all based, that the majority of the internet world actually is in the Asian region. But unlike the rest of the world, the penetration rates in Asia is actually still below 70%, which means that there's an opportunity for Asian territories to generate a leapfrog, which is one of the reasons why we're seeing so much innovation in the space of Web3 in places like the Philippines, and Vietnam, and even Indonesia. The kind of markets that normally have been ignored in the past have become important hotspots for the development of Web3 in particular. We spend so much time online right now. If you take a look at, just not the US, but also in Asia, what we're generally seeing is a lot of activity in the area where how we spend online. If you think of all the time that you're spending right now, the average time is spent roughly between 9 to 10 hours, for instance, that we're spending online, which is quite a bit. And if you also take a look at, for instance, the number of people that are playing games right now in the world, it's actually over 3 billion. And the majority of them also happen to be in Asia. And what's really happening right now is this battle for our attention, our time. This battle of attention of our time actually is what this is all about. It is actually this particular resource that we generate from our attention and time when we spend time on Instagram or on Facebook or on all of the games that we play. And it yields this incredible resource, what we think is the most valuable resource on Earth. And that resource is data. And what matters in the case of data is that it is not just the online resource or the resource of the metaverse. It has the ability to construct limitless network effects because of the fact that this comes from our ideas and our creativity. And this most valuable resource today is harvested by the platforms, whether this is Facebook or Google or Amazon or these amazingly large companies that basically mine our time and attention. Now, it's one thing to say that if you spend, half an hour or an hour a day, maybe that's fun and entertainment. But if we're spending 9 to 10 hours a day on these platforms, is that entertainment or are we in fact not just working for these platforms? Except that we don't think it's work, right? We believe for some reason because it appears to be free that we should be surrendering our data and our time to these platforms willingly so because they provide us some kind of benefit or some service. But what they benefit from is a much, much larger effect because we become these blocks of data that form pieces of information, and then this becomes knowledge. We do this as humans all the time, except that our ability to form knowledge from the data that we collect has a limited capacity because we can only process so much. But in the machine of AI and deep learning inside the platforms such as Facebook, they're actually able to really, really extract the value of it to the tune of billions of users, which originally started with selling things like advertising, but eventually became much larger. And so we think of an age in which we've been digitally colonized by the platforms. And the construction is such that today the world looks like this, where we are basically, in a sense, inside a feudal system controlled by the digital platforms, whether this is Apple, whether this is Google, whether this is Facebook. Ask the question for your own life. As an app developer, for instance, do you get to decide the fate of your app? Are you actually able to, release an app anytime you want, you need permission. You need permission from the platform. Without it, you're unable to do so, for instance. That Instagram handle you have on Facebook that may have millions of followers that you have cultivated, is that Instagram user actually, is that Instagram account yours? Or does it actually belong to the platform? They can remove it from you anytime. And that, of course, creates an issue, we think, because it means at the end of the time, we're so dependent on our digital lives. We're so dependent on what happens online. And yet we have no actual control over that because it belongs to a platform that can decide whatever it wants. And this, from our perspective, is also one of the reasons why there will be a continued rise in inequality as well. And this is not just a wealth inequality, it's also an access inequality, a kind of data inequality. If I have access and the ability to mine the value of that data, I have privileges. If I don't, or if I'm not even online, I don't have access to these benefits. And this is one of the big problems that we think blockchain and digital property rights can solve. Because what happens is that in the framework around this, data, which used to be a private good inside the control of a central platform that they decide what to do, data now becomes a public service in a public good, which means that you have the ability to compose new businesses and new experiences through these digital property rights, which now basically are built on a consensus of a public market or public community instead of one that is controlled by a single company. In other words, it's not just something controlled by the management or the shareholders of the company, it's something that can be controlled by the community at large. And so when pieces of content sort of go and become non-fungible tokens, they become platforms in themselves because they have the qualities of an asset. Let me explain that a little bit in the concept of cars. The fact that, for instance, we can have decentralized ownership of cars as a form of property in the physical world is the reason that we can actually have things like Uber or Didi, Grab in Singapore, or we can have people that make car wash companies or people who create baby seats. These are all actually interesting things that you can now develop because of the ownership of others, and new business opportunities can emerge because of the decentralized ownership of assets. And this is just for cars, it's for the houses you own, it's for the smartphones that you have. The fact that you can own a smartphone is a reason that you can have a case company or you can have a headphone company. And what's interesting here is that the headphone company that's making headphones for your smartphone doesn't need to ask permission from Google or Apple or Huawei or Lenovo or any of these companies whether they're allowed to do so. They can provide a value-added service on the ownership of people who have, for instance, smartphones. More importantly, though, the value of the smartphone and its utility increases as well because there is a plethora of services that are attached around the ownership of these assets. And of course, the service provider benefits from access of millions of customers that are the owners and want more value or more utility for the ownership of these assets that they have. This is something that is now possible with digital assets that wasn't possible before. And what that actually therefore means is that you're now able to have decentralized ownership, which basically means that with this decentralized ownership, you would then have digital interoperability. Means that, for instance, a sword in your favorite game would have the freedom to move from another game or another service. Now, maybe people ask the question, does it make sense for a game to have an asset transfer from one to another? And the point that we think is not the fact that it has to have an actual sort of defined utility from the original creator, because in the online world, as we see in the physical world, it's up to the adaptability and the creativity of whoever adds the service to create a new service. For instance, when you look at, for instance, the ownership of cars, the fact that we can have a baby seat was not done with the permission of Ford Motors back in the day. They just created the baby seat and adapted it based on the construction of the car. And the same thing is what we see here as well. If I have, for instance, a skin in my favorite game or a digital asset of some sort, the way I adapt it in my environment is going to be entirely different than maybe the way that was intended. That is the power of human creativity. That is the reason why we have invention and innovation, that things are created outside of our initial imagination because other people have the ability to construct freely. And this is only possible when you have decentralized ownership, such that these peer-to-peer ownership economics can actually come to bear. And one of the reasons we think gaming will become such an important force is because gaming is the one area where people already have an understanding of digital ownership, because all the time that they spend inside these games, they should be their assets. Whether they have utility beyond the game is really not sort of a decision of the game developer, we feel. It is something that the community themselves should be able to dictate. But one of the criticisms that people have also made is that, games and blockchain and Web3 appear to be primitive. However, this was something maybe true a few years ago, but today the game qualities have increased a lot. For instance, with games such as Phantom Galaxy, which is basically a kind of, it's a star sort of a star fighting type game. You can see that the quality of the graphics in the blockchain game Phantom Galaxy has improved dramatically, and is based on Unreal, and the quality is very strong, and you're basically able to enjoy the game and enjoy basically experiencing your digital assets as you play a game where you have actual ownership. Or take a game like Life Beyond, which is in an alpha, which is basically a massively multiplayer online game built basically by a French studio that we also have a stake in. But more importantly, actually the quality of these graphics, if you compare what blockchain games used to look like just a few years ago, have also improved. And of course, you have community building platforms, very similar to what we see with Roblox or, of course, Minecraft, but now in the form of our own sandbox, which is basically an open world builder where you can basically create, very similarly to sort of Minecraft, your own communities, except now you have ownership. And whatever communities and whatever worlds you build and whatever assets you build inside the sandbox actually becomes yours. And you have the ability to basically pass it on, have people play experiences in it, and do what you want to do with the freedom of your choice. And more importantly, because you own it, you can never lose it. This is the other important part, that ownership gives you the ability to basically take control of it, regardless of what we as the original game developer would like to do, which gives you a kind of digital freedom as well. Now, of course, that means that third parties will then be able to come in and construct new effects on top of the ownership of things. We don't know what that might look like, but today people do provide, for instance, areas where you can sort of rent your assets, for instance, or there's other marketplaces for these assets. And that is possible, again, through decentralized ownership, where third parties will start coming in and creating these effects. And this is really only possible with a kind of property right, a kind of digital property right in this case, but it's the same effect that we have in the physical world. When you take a look, for instance, in the actual world today, the kind of countries that have low property rights have very low GDPs. But the kind of countries that have very high property rights or have very secure property rights have enjoyed, basically much better economics and much stronger GDPs. And particularly in this part of the world, in Asia, we have seen the benefits of what happens to a nation that goes from an area that never had strong property rights to improved or better property rights. There has been very clearly an improvement in the GDP of these countries. And we think the digital space, the metaverse, will function exactly the same way. And of course, as a result of that, you can have these decentralized autonomous organizations where you're now able basically to decide things through the ownership of digital property and have community consensus around things like decisions of where the games might go or your digital assets would go. These things could be something that is a bit more empowering for end users. So one way to look at the metaverse is effectively the kind of construction of a national economy of some sort, a national virtual economy. These basically are things that you can function on an area of the metaverse. And the way to think of environments such as the other side or such as the sandbox, for instance, are kind of quasi mini nations almost of some sort, where you have actual real activity because of the fact that you can have actual digital ownership. So I think one of the most amazing things here really is that what happens basically in the space of what we describe as Web3 is that platforms that used to be owned by the corporations basically go into community-owned platforms. And we think that that not only just creates sort of a better outcome for people, but also creates a more open and fair infrastructure that therefore then also creates a more open and fair and secure type of internet. One that is not controlled by single corporations, but one that has one where you have to build with some level of consensus and a high level of responsibility to the very users who create value to the network. Because after all, if we stop using these Web2 platforms, what is the value of these platforms? Nothing, because we are the ones who provide value for them. And therefore, we should be able to have a say in this. We also think that when this kind of environment happens, where the community has a kind of say and a governance in these type of sort of, environments, then it will create companies that are not entirely driven by just profit motives, which has been the traditional idea of shareholder capitalism, but instead will have a kind of stakeholder capitalism, which doesn't make necessarily profit as the primary agenda of these companies, but has to also see that how can they best serve the community. And I think this is the future of Web3. This is the hope that we have, that Web3 can build this more open, fair, and inclusive internet. Thank you very much.